So before discussing volume-based costing, or in other words, job costing, you first need to understand what overhead is and why it's kind of tricky. So overhead is just every cost associated with creating a product that is not the direct materials or direct labor. Therefore, overhead is this enormous amass of costs. And so it is very tricky to determine exactly how much overhead a business used throughout a period, how much they should set aside for their financial records, or how much overhead specifically went to one individual unit of a product or one group of units for a product. So to simplify these processes, businesses will use volume-based costing or job costing. So within volume-based costing, they will use something called an allocation base. So before we actually begin the steps of volume-based costing, we need to learn also what an allocation base is. So an allocation base is basically a measurement of how busy a company is in a certain period, or also an allocation base is a good measure of how much of a business's resources a certain product uses. So, and a good example of an allocation base is the number of units a business produces. So, and the reason for this is that if a company is making 200 units, it's almost entirely more busy than a company that only makes 2 units of the same unit. So, in one month, you may only make 10 units and you're not very busy. So, that allocation base tells you that you're really not doing much in that month. However, the next month, again, you may make 100 units. So, your allocation base is telling you that you're very busy. Some other common allocation bases are machine hours and direct labor hours. So all of those can tell you kind of if you're more busy during a certain period, or if a product is using a lot of those, then it tells you that the product is using a lot of a company's resources. Now, in managerial accounting problems, they will tell you exactly what your allocation base is, because really these are subject to what the company believes is a good measurement of how busy they are. So they will tell you these in the problems. Now, to actually dive into volume-based costing or job costing, we need to know that it's just 3 simple steps. And these simple steps are listed up here in this box right here, but they're also listed down here, step 1, 2, and 3. Now, these are the same steps. It's just these steps in the bottom are written out in a timeline format, which I think makes it easier to understand for students. So I'm going to be focusing on this timeline format, but just know that up above there are the same exact 3 steps. So one thing to also know before we discuss this timeline is that in each step, you're going to be looking at a different type of overhead. The first step deals with budgeted overhead. The second step deals with applied overhead. And the third step deals with actual overhead. And these will make more sense as we discuss each step. So we're going to look at this graph as just one big year. So this is the time period that we're looking at. Now, the first step takes place at the very beginning of the year, before the year even started. So in this step, we're going to be looking at the budget overhead. So we're going to take the budget overhead, which is what we expect or estimate the overhead to be, and we're going to divide that by the budgeted or estimated allocation base. Once we do that, that's going to give us a rate. So that rate basically says that for every unit of allocation base we use, so for every unit you produce or for every machine hour worked, you're going to most likely incur this many dollars in overhead. So this rate basically says the relationship between the allocation base, or how busy you are, and the amount of overhead that you incur. So again, both of these are budgeted because at the beginning of the year, you don't actually know what they are yet. The second step involves applied overhead. So in the second step, the year is actually happening. So although you can't necessarily tell exactly what the overhead is throughout each month, and you can't tell exactly how much overhead is going to each individual product, you can see exactly how much actual allocation base you're using. So you may be able to tell exactly how many products you're making or exactly how many machine hours you're working. So in the second step, you're just going to take that actual allocation base and multiply it by the rate you found in the first step to find your applied overhead. Now, in the third step, all you're going to do is you're going to compare the applied overhead with the actual overhead. Now, to find the actual overhead, you're just going to have to make a list of all the indirect costs and add them up. Indirect manufacturing costs, I should specify. So these basically include every product cost that is not direct labor or direct materials. So good examples of indirect manufacturing costs that are likely going to be your manufacturing overhead involve the factory rent, the factory maintenance people, the factory supervisors, indirect materials used to create the product, the utilities of the factory, and so on. So you're going to find this actual overhead and you're going to compare it with the applied overhead that you found in step 2. Make sure to not compare it with the estimated or budgeted overhead. It's very important, and we'll explain in the future. So all you're going to do is compare them. And if your applied overhead is greater than your actual overhead, then that means the amount of overhead that you set aside each month, which is your applied overhead, is more than you actually needed in overhead for each month. So you over applied the overhead. However, if the applied overhead is smaller than the actual overhead, then that means the amount of overhead that you set aside for each month that you thought you were using in overhead is actually not enough, and you actually used more overhead than you thought. So you need to kind of right that wrong. So in that case, you are under applying overhead. Now, one thing to note is the reason you don't want to use budgeted overhead is because budgeted overhead doesn't really have any fiscal power. So budget overhead is just an estimation of what you think you're going to use throughout the year, whereas the applied overhead is the actual amount of money you set aside throughout the period for overhead, thinking that you're using. So if you over applied 100,000 dollars in overhead, then that's kind of a problem because you spent $100,000 too much. Whereas if you budgeted $100,000 more in overhead, that's still an issue, but it's more of an issue for your analytics team. It doesn't carry any fiscal weight unless you acted on it fiscally. So again, do not compare the budgeted with the actual. Only compare the applied overhead with the actual overhead. Now, one thing to note is that in these questions, they're most likely going to ask you to find the total manufacturing cost of an item. And as you should know, that is direct materials plus direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. So in this case, what we really want to focus on for overhead is we want to focus on applied overhead generally in these types of problems. So if it's asking you for the total cost of a certain product, again, you want to go and use applied overhead in these types of problems when you're doing a job costing problem. So again, job costing is just based off of these 3 simple steps. They're both listed here in different formats, all 3 of these steps. And again, just one thing to really remember is that in the 3rd and final step, make sure you only compare the applied overhead with the actual overhead. Yeah, so that is how you perform job costing.